Hello everyone, and welcome to part 2 of The Road to Morar. Tonight is live from our headquarters here in Scotland, but we will put this on the channel afterwards for those who are going to watch it on catch up. Thanks to everyone for joining tonight of a Tuesday evening. It's an exciting way to connect with you all. My name is Gordon. I'm one of the founders of Marlow Watch Company. My job at Marlow is to design all our watches, take them through manufacture, and once they're produced and delivered, help out with the marketing of those watches through videos and photos and things like that. We're coming up for 8 years old now already, and it was in 2015 when a chap called Oliver got in touch with me out the blue to say that he was looking for advice to start his own watch company, and he couldn't find anybody, and found me online. And after a matter of months going back and forth, we decided to go at it together. And over the intervening 7 years, we have gone on to release a number of watches. We have grown and expanded our business. Moved up to Scotland, which is brilliant. And as we close out this year, we decided it was time to do another video series, much like our Road to Coniston, but this time in real time, so that we can take you through our way of bringing watches to market. The aim of this series is to give you guys a bit of insight into how we go about thinking, researching, designing, developing and producing our watches. And in a way, kind of bring you along on the journey, because a lot of my time is spent hidden away in the dark, working silently, doing a lot of interesting things, and you don't see any of this process. You only see the final product. And so it's going to be a bit of an interesting but hopefully fun way for me to design in this way, with these regular check-in points, updating you on how things are going, and interacting with you in a way that we don't usually get to do. Speaking of which, if you want to chat with me tonight, there's a wee chat box at the right hand side, and just drop a wee message in there. You can @ Marlow Watch Company and I'll see it. It will highlight on my wee thing here. So yeah, let's get started. Tonight I've called this episode "What is a dive watch anyway?" And it's usually the first question I ask myself whenever we begin a new project. What is the type of watch that we want to design? Why is it important? And what is the origins of this type of watch? It's a way for me to get my creative brain moving. It forms the earliest part of my quite in-depth research process. And the question isn't really just about dive watches and their technical requirements. It's, why does a dive watch exist in the first place? A quick Google and you can see for yourself, the Panerai Radiomere, right, done. And then you can go from there if you want to, but I want to go a bit further than that. I want to kind of go back to why are divers in existence, and why is the industry of diving here, and how did we come to end up with people going under the surface? And by doing this, it allows me to get exposed to more things and interesting avenues that I might not have went down before. And also, by doing this in-depth research process, you end up discovering people and feats of endurance and human endeavour that are really quite inspirational, and it all feeds into this design process and informs the end product. So tonight, the question, what is a dive watch anyway? We're going to talk about the history of that whole industry and that process. And it's a good way, by going back, notching back in history, you can get to the source of this, the origins of why a dive watch exists. You need to know where to stop, because if you keep on going back, you end up at the big bang, and then that's just far too much information. But there's a natural point at which you go, right, I'm going to start from here and go forwards and see what we can uncover. So, there's a couple of things I want to kind of get down as fundamentals before we go forward, and just remember these as we go through this kind of evening. The first is necessity is the mother of all invention. Somebody wants to do something and they don't know how to do it because there's nothing that's there to support them, and so they have to invent the method or the thing to be able to do that. And it's always necessity. People just don't invent things for the sake of it. They want to do something specifically. And the second is innovation is a result of human nature to want to do things better. So how do we improve what has already been before? And these two things are important as we go through this process, because ultimately, in our position in 2022, dive watches, as they were originally invented and innovated, are not required anymore. They're not a necessity to do something. And the innovations in the dive watch industry have already pretty much been done. There's not very much innovation left in terms of a technical standpoint. Design's a whole different matter, but from a technical innovation standpoint, we've kind of reached the natural conclusion of dive watches. So yeah, two things to remember as we go. So going back, we end up at the question of, well, why are people going under the water anyway? And it seems to originate from ancient Greece and the kind of free diving down to get natural sponges. The necessity was, well, there's stuff under the water we want to get to that can improve our lives, perhaps. Bathing was important to the ancient Greeks. And it was a way to, gather commodities that could be sold. And so the natural sponges seems to have been the first real desire for people to go under the water. And then we kind of jump. We're going to do a lot of jumping tonight. And it should be said that this isn't a cover-all history evening. We'd be here all night if we were to talk about the history of everything. But jump forward to more of a kind of trade perspective and something called the Silk Road, or as now it's termed the Silk Route, because there seems to be not just one road, it's a bunch of things feeding into this road or route. And this was a way for people in the West to get exotic things from the East, so spices, silks, paper, a whole load of things that were exotic and could be brought to the West and then propagated through into high society and things. And they were really, valuable commodities. And towards the tail end of this Silk Route, it was the Romans that were kind of using this road the most. And the hub of this route was Constantinople. And this was eventually taken over by the Ottomans and then closed. And so this route from east to west was kaput. And so the people who were relying on these commodities and wanted exotic things from the east had to find a different way to get to India, the Spice Islands, places like that. And so we leap forward again to what is kind of catch-all called the Age of Discovery. Again, from a 2022 perspective, it's now called the Age of Discovery from a European perspective. But this was a way for people to get to these exotic routes by sea. And it was the Portuguese who pioneered these routes. Let me just put this like that. It was the Portuguese who pioneered the first easterly route down the coast of Africa and up to India and then across. And they ended up discovering this route and were able to bring back and forth these exotic spices, cloves and cinnamon and things like that people really valued. At one point, cloves were as valuable as gold. They were really, really, rare and exotic things. And so began a kind of competition between Portugal and Castile at the time, modern-day Spain. They weren't happy with each other, and Castile wanted to find another route, so they went west. And by doing this, going over the Atlantic, they sent a guy called Colombo west, and he arrived at land and thought, God, I've made it to India. But he hadn't. He'd made it to America. That was... This was an age of discovery. People didn't know where they were, so... Christopher Colombo, as we call him now, he ended up just faffing about America for a while and trying to get rich and spreading Christianity and his faith. And so it was down to a guy called Magellan to find a route west. And he did. He ended up going across the Atlantic, down South America, and found a route through South America, which is now called the Strait of Magellan. And ended up, it was such a struggle, getting through this route that he had found, that when he arrived at the other side, it was so calm and peaceful that he called it Mar Pacifico, the peaceful sea. And this is why we call that ocean the Pacific Ocean. And he continued on. He did find the Spice Islands, and he got into a bit of a fracas with the guys there and ended up getting killed. And only one vessel made it back to Castile. So I tell you all that to tell you this: in the endeavour of going by sea and discovering these places, there was a lot of shipwrecks. There was a lot of these valuable commodities that ended up getting lost to the sea, and thus began the necessity to get under the ocean and recover these things, because they were valuable and people had made the effort to get them. So this seems to be the kind of beginnings of the desire to go purposefully deep under the sea. And it began a kind of phase of early subsurface technology, starting off with stuff like this, the diving bell. This is, as near as damn it, just an upturned cup. If you turn a cup and put it in a bath, you end up trapping the air in there, and that allows people, if you sink that to the bottom, to exist, albeit for a very short time. And so, this began the technological development of these diving bells to allow people to get under the surface. And this is the beginnings of diving as we know it today. Let me just have a quick whiz through the comments to see if there's anybody saying anything. No. Okay, so from here, they start developing these and innovating this technology. How can we do this better? And so, the diving bells were progressed. It's always funny to me when I'm researching these things, when you discover all the historical, diagrams and drawings. It appears that a lot of early innovation, especially 19th and early 20th century innovation, it seems to be developed from the perspective of fitting in with people's lifestyles at the time. How can we do this but still retain our lifestyles? And this is a really good picture because it shows that these guys are willing to go down in this diving bell, but only if they're still allowed to wear their velvet jackets and hats. The whole idea of getting wet, it's just not, I'm still wearing my nice trousers. And it's really funny to see all these different plates and slides with these period figures and how they've adapted this way of doing something, but as long as it fits around their lifestyle. And soon enough, the technology was more, well, let's fit this around a person, for mobility and being able to get about places a bit easier. And again, kind of culminating in this really evocative piece of apparatus, which is called diving dress. Big bronze, big metal, heavy things that iteratively allowed people to do things underwater a bit easier, so the head can rotate, or they've got more portholes to see out of, and things like that. And so it keeps iterating on and on through some questionable ideas, to get to the kind of this stage where it's the modern kind of idea of diving with breathing apparatus, scuba. And it's kind of remained like this since this point. The mouthpieces and things have developed and been improved, but as a kind of concept, this is kind of where we're at now with diving. A pair of goggles, a mouthpiece, an air tank, and some flippers, and off you go. So yeah, that's the kind of diving part. This is the kind of brief history of why there's people diving and what is required to dive. And then from that, the ability to do these things then obviously transitions into, well, how can we utilize this to give us an advantage in the theatre of conflict, through the very, very strict prism of innovation and development and the speed of development. Conflict is a very, very efficient way to progress things quickly. And dive watches is the same. There were watches, obviously, before the wars, pocket watches. The First World War, people wore pocket watches, but it was during that war that people transitioned watches from pockets to wrists with things called trench watches. You soldered a couple of lugs on, leather strap, you've now got a wristwatch. And so wristwatches were becoming a bit more of a thing. And of course then people thought, well, why can we not wear these in the water? Water resistance hadn't really been developed, and it was Rolex that developed the kind of first, I guess, agreed water-resistant watch with the Oyster, which was used marketing-wise by a lady called Mercedes Gleitz, who strung a Rolex Oyster around her neck and swam the English Channel, to great success, and it kind of proved the concept of waterproof watches. And at the same time, Omega were developing their own take on this water-resistant watch called the Marine. And then World War II arrived, and water-resistant watches became more of a kind of requirement, and canteen-style water resistance, where you've got a kind of cup that you thread over the crown, given that the crown is generally accepted as the most vulnerable part of a watch. These canteen-style developments were pioneered by Hamilton, Elgin and Waltham. Again, given to military operatives in the war. But the first kind of bona fide dive watch, as we know and understand it, began with this. Again, it was a requirement of conflict that brought this about. It was the Italian Royal Navy that approached Panerai and said, we need a watch that can work underwater. And so Panerai developed this with Rolex, again, called the Radiomere. And this is generally accepted to be the first dive watch, purposefully designed for use underwater. And I guess it's another, it's part of the research, I guess, for me to try and discover and learn about the human endeavour of these things and the toll, I guess, that it took on people. And this is a great example, this Panerai, because it was the first watch to use radium paint for the glowing markings in hands. And you don't know what you don't know, I guess. And they didn't know that radioactive paint was bad for you. So there's a great, I guess it's a story about the radium girls, the ladies who painted these watch dials. And they were told that the paint was inert, and they were happy to use it. And in actual fact, they painted their nails and even painted their teeth with this radium paint But the biggest problem came from the method that they used to prime their brushes to paint these dials, and they used to use their lips to create this point in their brushes, and as a result, of course, being radioactive paint, they got ill, and there was some serious problems. But again, invention, innovation, of course we now don't use radioactive paints for dials, but that was the beginnings of it all. And so there we go, the Panerai Radiomir was the first kind of step in this trajectory of dive watches. And it wasn't for another almost 20 years that things kind of remained that way until the 50 Fathoms came along. This was post-war, and it kind of rose to fame not because of its diving prowess, but because of marketing. Jacques Cousteau wore this watch to Cannes in promotion of one of his films, and it was at that point that people began seeing the dive watch as an aspirational thing to have or to own or to wear. At this very same time, Zodiac were developing the Seawolf in 1953 as well, and of course the Rolex Submariner. And from this point, it very much was, your post-war, these are aspirational things for recreational diving and swimming and things like that. And it kind of heralded in this age of one-upmanship, iteratively developing better and more capable watches that can go deeper, pushing limitations of what's possible. And this is where this iconic design language has stemmed from, especially with Rolex. It's become the blueprint, if you like, for what a dive watch should look like. So yeah, that's kind of where we're at. The how we got to needing a dive watch, and then the kind of quick development and cementing of what a dive watch should look like. But what does a dive watch have over other watches? What makes a dive watch a dive watch? Obviously, the first step of a dive watch is to resist water. Now, water resistance, I guess we should touch upon this. In watchland, water resistance isn't what it says it is, which is a bit daft, but for example, if you have a watch that is capable to 30 meters or water resistance to 30 meters, if you go to 30 meters, the water will get in. It basically means that you can splash it with water and it will be okay. But if you were to dunk it in the sink, water would get in. I don't know why I don't know why it's this way. There's no point in challenging it. This is just the kind of standard to which we adhere to. 100-meter watches are great for surface swimming and showering, that's fine. But a dive watch needs to be capable beyond 100 meters of measured distance. And so for a water resistance rating, 200 meters and beyond is where we need to start for it to be classed as a dive watch. A dive watch usually has a unidirectional bezel with a 60-minute scale and pip. Usually they have robust cases, some are muckle big great metal blocks, others are a bit more refined, but they're usually robust, they're very capable and have a screw down crown. Simon says my 600-meter dive watch comes off when I do the washing up. Well, we all make choices, Simon. Interestingly enough, when I was doing this kind of slide presentation and stumbled upon the Hamilton, what was the other two? Waltham and Elgin canteen style watches. That the screw down crown is kind of an iteration of that. A canteen mechanism is a cup that you unscrew and it's loose. It can be attached to the case by a chain or some kind of metal hinge, but it's attached through a flap. Whereas a screw down crown is still a canteen style mechanism, but it's attached on the axis through spring. Sorry, I'm just reading the comments there. So yeah, a dive watch usually has a robust case with screw down crown. It has luminous markings and hands, usually quite bright. Bold dials, very simple. You certainly don't want to look at your watch when you're under the water, needing to see where you are measurement-wise and having to search for the hands or where you are or orient yourself. So it needs to be really bold and really simple. Water-resistant strap, obviously, whether that's rubber, silicone, canvas, or some kind of composite. So that's the kind of baseline, what makes a dive watch a dive watch. That's our kind of baseline spec sheet. And you could, if you want, go from there and just use that as the kind of standard and design from there. But there's one other thing I want to touch on, and it's the ISO standard for divers' watches. This is something that we were aware of when we first designed the first edition Morar back in 2017. And this ISO 6425 is a framework for dive watches that guarantees, I guess, the robustness of this watch and allows you certain privileges. So this is taken from the ISO website, and you can download. You have to purchase the standard. And the document, I'll just read out the abstract there. This document specifies requirements and test methods for divers' watches and for saturation divers' watches for use in deep diving. It applies to divers' watches designed to withstand diving in water at depths of at least 100 metres and equipped with a secured measuring system to indicate the diving time, which is visible in darkness. But there's a crucial wee bit at the bottom here, this bit. Moreover, it indicates the marking which the manufacturer is authorised to apply to them. So in a way, this ISO standard is also a marketing tool, because you can signify, you can designate, you can mark on your watches that this applies to this standard through the term diver's watch. So divers plus the depth. So divers 200 metres, divers 300 metres. And it's a quick shorthand way of saying this has been certified to ISO 6425. So we'll talk about that a wee bit. So in kind of short or in brief, this is what is required for a watch to hit the ISO watch requirements and be certified. Now at the bottom left there, you'll see there's our list of baseline standard stuff which makes a dive watch. And so the first one is a protected diving timing indicator rotating bezel. So the protected part of this is basically that if you set this dive bezel to your minute hand, giving you 60 minutes of dive time, you don't, or you shouldn't be able to hit that bezel in a way that it extends your dive time. So you set it as 60 minutes, and then 10 minutes later, if you look at it and it's still 60 minutes, then it's a problem, because that's a very crucial countdown. You're relying on it for air or whatever. So the protected part is securing that bezel so that it only goes one way. It can only shorten the time. And so at the bottom left there, you'll see a unidirectional bezel with 60-minute scale and pip fulfills this criteria. Again, the second part, indication that the watch is running, visible in total darkness, and legible after 180 minutes or 3 hours in total darkness at a distance of 25 centimetres. Again, it's quite easy to achieve this. You just make sure that your luminous markings and hands have enough luminous compound to be bright enough and have longevity enough to last 3 hours. Lume works on a principle of the more density there is of the luminous material, like a thicker block of it, will be brighter and last longer than a very thin veneer of paint. So the more you have, the more reserve you have of that luminous compound, the longer and brighter and better it is. So it's quite easy to achieve that part in the ISO standard. But then we get to this bit, and this is the bit that separates why people either have ISO certified watches or not. And it's to do with testing. So to fulfill the ISO 6425 watch requirements, you need to take 100% of your watches. So if you manufacture 1,000 watches, 1,000 have to be tested to the water resistance that you've rated it at, plus 125% overpressure. And you also have to take all of those watches, 1,000 of them, and test for environmental conditions like fogging. And then there's a bunch of selective testing: magnetic resistance, physical shock, hitting it with something, salt water resistance, thermal shock, and reliability for condensation. Now there's a couple of things in here. Again, when I was compiling this, I had a thought that a lot of dive watches and a lot of questions that we get asked are about bronze dive watches. Why are you not making dive watches in bronze? You saw the dive helmet, that was all formed in bronze. It's a really evocative material. It patinas and it takes on its own personality, and it's unique to you. And I wondered if there was any ISO certified dive watches that were made out of bronze, because the selective testing of salt water resistance kind of goes against that requirement. If you make a watch out of bronze, it's going to corrode and thus shouldn't fulfill that requirement. But there are watches out there that are ISO divers watches and are made out of bronze. Looking further into this test, it's basically a saltwater spray that they scoosh onto the watch, and then they leave it for 48 hours, 2 days. And then as long as the watch retains its usability, it can still rotate and do things as it should do, then it seems to pass. So the point I'm making is there's a bit of interpretation involved in this watch requirement. I don't know what would happen if you didn't stick to this requirement and put divers on your dial. I don't know what happens if you get sued or something. I don't know, but I'm not willing to find out. But it's these are the 2 points that cause people like us to have pause, because it's expensive. It's very expensive to test every single one of your watches. It's expensive because if it fails the test, you have to resubmit it. You take it out of this testing process, you take it apart, you reassemble it, and you submit it again for testing. And if it fails again, you've got to keep doing that. Ian asked, Gordon, does everyone know what a scoosh is? A scoosh is when you use one of these things and you scoosh. That's for my plants, that squishy ball. Yeah, it's the testing that separates ISO certified watches and not. The water resistance and the pressure is not so much of a big thing, but it is a big thing, but it's not so much of a problem. It's the second point, the environmental conditions. The test for this fogging is a 60-minute cool down of each watch. So 1,000 watches all at, I think it's minus 20 for 60 minutes, and then back up to room temperature for, I think it's maybe 10 minutes, and then heated to 60 degrees, and then wiped. And if it's got fogging under the crystal, it's failed. And so that process for every watch is 2 hours long, there or thereabouts. And so if you've got 1,000 watches, that's 2,000 hours of someone's time to test these watches. And so a lot of people can't afford that, especially us. And so we design for spec and we test for budget. I would love to be able to have an ISO certified dive watch, but the testing is so expensive and really only gives you a marketing leverage to put divers on your dial. If you think about it, you know, watches that pass this test don't pass just by chance. You go, oh, great, we passed, we've done it. You've designed the watch to pass this test. It's engineered to be able to withstand all of the requirements of this ISO test, the certificate. And it's why we put on the Morar designed to ISO standards, because it could have easily passed all these tests, but we just couldn't afford to test the Morar, every single one of them. I think we ended up having 1,250 of these watches made, and so we just couldn't afford it. But it's an interesting thing to discuss, why the ISO standard isn't more widely used. It's a very, I know Seiko and Citizen and people like that do have ISO certified dive watches. There's a brand called Helm. They just, all they do is ISO certified dive watches. But for us, it's more, design it and engineer it to capability, and then, do the testing that satisfies us in terms of robustness and fitness for purpose. But I think to then go on to do an ISO test at mass expense is not worth it for the very little that we get back. So yeah, moving on. A couple more points. Modern dive watches, like I said, we're in this phase now where dive watches, as they were originally intended, are not required anymore, because we have dive computers now. But modern dive watches, by which I mean things like the Morar, are only usable up to 130 feet or 40 meters, because after this point, more complex calculations are required for decompression. Thus, the rotating bezel becomes obsolete. You do get such things as decompression bezels. Doxa do these decompression bezels, which is just basically a different scale on that rotating bezel that allows you to see how deep and for how long you can remain at that depth before you have to resurface to avoid decompression sickness. But yeah, we're in the age now where we have digital dive computers which chart a lot more accurately your depth, your nitrogen intake, your blood. It can do all this stuff. It can alert you to where you are, and you're right, time to go back up. And the digital dive computers are far more capable than analog dive watches could ever be. There are divers that use dive watches as redundancy, so if their dive computer blows up or fails in some way, they have another method of timing. But there's not really any real modern day use for dive watches. And so the question then is asked, who is a dive watch for? And this is the kind of crux of it. If we're not designing for intended use, a dive watch for people to use to time their dives and things, then what are we designing it for, or who are we designing it for? But I'll take a quick wee break just to whiz up the chat here and see what's going on. Lots of people in. So let's just have a wee look. Alex says, will you be swimming to the bottom of Loch Morar with the Morar 2? I think there's only been one chap who has dived down to the equivalent depth of Loch Morar, and he had 12 air canisters or something, and he had a diving bell over him, and it was real. I think he almost died as well doing it. But to answer your question, no, I will not be swimming to the bottom of Loch Morar. Kirk says, interesting, no timing bezel. I think that was in relation to the Panerai radio mirror. Kirk, for me, a dive watch needs 200 meters plus. Timing bezel, no date. A case that looks better than more scars and bashes. Comfortable in hot sun. A reminder of 2 weeks in Bora Bora, the 50 weeks in a boring meetings. What do you mean by comfortable in hot sun, Kirk? I guess the sun is hot anyway, but yeah, 200 meters plus timing bezel. No date, the old date argument. In a case it looks better than more scars and bashes. Matt Hurst says, love proper lume on the bezel, which I think is a must. I have a Pelagos which glows brilliantly in the dark. Proper lume on the bezel. Does that mean you want the bezel to be luminous or just a pip that is really effective? What would be the reasons for unidirectional and one-way bezels? I always thought one-way was preferred. One-way is essential, Paul. It's absolutely essential to the effectiveness of this. The purpose for this diving bezel is so that you can only turn it one way and only shorten the time that you've set so that you don't get tricked into thinking that you've been down for shorter than you have. Yeah. So yeah, it has to go one way. Scoosh, I've covered that. Unfortunately, the bronze scratch is showing the bright steel underneath. There should be a batch test option. It's usually an option in standards I've had to meet. Batch testing is okay for the selective testing, Kirk. So you can selective test for magnetism, corrosion, and physical shock. But every single one of your watches has to be tested for depth and overpressure and environmental susceptibility, so fogging. There is no batch option for that. You have to do every single one. Simon's asking, can I ask what sort of price increase it would add to a watch to make it ISO standard viable out of interest? We did ask the question, and I think it was something like $60 or £60 more per watch to get them ISO certified. I think because we do produce in small batches, it's a lot more expensive. If we were to make 20,000 dive watches, I think being able to test for ISO standards would be a lot cheaper, economies of scale. But for us, it's just not viable, I don't think. Andy Clark says, for me, a dive watch is for all everyday use, swimming, walking, cycling, climbing. In other words, a tough everyday watch. Yeah, so who is a dive watch for? Well, you are a diver. If you're a diver, you will have, in this day and age, a digital dive computer. So would it be for a diver? Probably not. Maybe you're thinking of becoming a diver. Same thing. You will, in this day and age, get a digital dive computer. So maybe a dive watch is for somebody that likes the security of capability, the robustness, the fact that it's built and engineered and designed to this depth means that it's inherently robust. And so, like Andy said, it's great for everyday use. Maybe it's an aspirational or a status thing. I would like to have this watch because it will be recognised as a dive watch, and then, I feel seen. Or whatever. It's aspirational. Or maybe you just like the aesthetics. You're into the whole world of diving or nautical themes or ships or whatever, and the aesthetic of a dive watch really resonates with you. And these last three are the ones that I think we'll focus on. People who want a really robust watch, maybe it's aspirational, they like the whole concept of this being from the history of divers and pioneers and, brave people, and people that like the aesthetics of dive watches. Paul says, sorry, too long at the computer today, thanks. Thanks for stopping in, Paul, I really appreciate that, and get some break for the old eyes there. Right, so the next consideration for us is movement. And I've said this a number of times before, but the movement is where everything starts from a design perspective. Unless you have the movement chosen, you can't do anything design-wise because you don't know the caliber diameter, you don't know the thickness, you don't know the hand heights, you don't know anything. And so the movement is really important before we get started on the design. Now for us, that means a manual or an automatic mechanical watch. But of course there are quartz dive watches around. And I guess from a functional standpoint, quartz watches are really good because you have reassurance that if you put a fresh battery in, you know that it's going to last. If you go diving the next day, it's going to be fine. We did try the Morar when I first designed it in 2017. Was designed as a manual mechanical dive watch, and it was one of the biggest reasons that the Morar project took so long to get to manufacture, because we spent so long trying to find a way to make the Morar manual without compromising the operational side of the watch. Now, if you think about a manual watch and winding it up, so you take, for example, the Coniston or the Haskell or the Pacific, you wind the crown, wind, and you reach a hard stop. The movement doesn't let that crown turn anymore. But on a dive watch, the crown is out from the case. You've unscrewed it and it's out. And unless you can screw that crown back into the case, the watch is burst. You can't go underwater with it because water would just get in. But you also can't screw the crown in because the direction of the thread is the direction of the wind. And so you end up with this kind of rock and hard place. You can't get the crown in and you can't wind it forward. And so we spent ages thinking, well, maybe we could train people or educate people to say, right, well, wind it so far and then screw it in and then you're fine. But then you don't have any confidence of how much the mainspring's been wound up, and you don't know how long the watch will last. And that's crucial to... You don't want your watch stopping halfway down the dive. In actual fact, I've got here part of the process that I went through, trying to understand how we could get around this manual winding problem with a dive watch. And so I thought about different lunatic mechanisms to try and isolate the crown from the winding train, and spent a bit of time trying to engineer the problem. But with stuff like this, when you're engineering bespoke mechanical joints and mechanism, the cost escalates so hugely. So this was part of my kind of design process, trying to think how can I have a manual winding movement and have a screw down crown. I even thought about reverse threads, so you wind the watch this way and then you thread it onto the case that way, and then you're getting around the whole thing. But for some reason manufacturers can't do reverse threads. Anyway, so for us the movement has to be automatic. We don't do quartz and we can't do manual wind. You do get crowns where when you unwind them from the case, you unscrew them from the case, they bounce out boing, and there's a big spring that allows you to isolate the crown from the winding mechanism. But then the crown's really loose and it feels really flimsy, and it doesn't bestow robustness when you unscrew your crown and it flaps about. So there are ways to get around it, but a dive watch should look, feel and operate robustly, in our opinion. So, moving forward, this is the kind of spec that I think we should be setting ourselves for the Morar Second Edition. It has to have water resistance greater than 300 metres, obviously, because Loch Morar is 310 metres deep. So it'll either be 310 or greater. It will have an automatic mechanical movement, a unidirectional bezel with 60-minute scale and pip. It will have a robust case with screw-down crown, luminous markings in hands, bold dial with simplicity, a water-resistant strap, and it will be designed to meet, like the Morar First Edition was, the requirements of ISO 6425:2018. This is the spec for the next Morar Second Edition. And a black and yellow version, as Simon Dando says. Yep. This is where this is basically what the Morar First Edition was. But it's good to go through this process and really think about, well, what do we want this watch to be, and get ourselves a brief like that, which we can just pin to the wall and say, right, that's our goal. That's what we want to create. And so from this point, I need to stop hitting the microphone. From this point, it's research time. So this is the point at which I go, right, we've got the kind of technical brief for the Morar. And it's time for me to get kind of immersed in the world, not just of dive watches and diving, but like you've seen, the kind of historical process leading up to why dive watches were even needed in the first place. And you never know what you're going to uncover. You know, it could be something as oblique as a Roman bronze dish, and you know it might have a nice profile on it, and you think, oh, that might look quite good as part of the case, or you never know what you're going to uncover. And so from here, it's very much an in-depth research process and building up a picture of what the aesthetics of the Morar should be. And from this process, then it will instruct the design inherently. It will feel part of this whole nautical diving world. So yeah, the next episode will be following on from this and discuss what we've learned in these 7 years, not just for the Morar and the Morar project, which we'll talk about, and my aspirations for it and why it didn't work and things like that, but also what we've learned as a business and as a design, from a design perspective, what's worked, what hasn't, what can we do on dials and cases and things like that we never knew when the Morar was first designed in 2017. And I go from there. There's a whole load of episodes to come. This is going to be a long process. I hope you'll stick with me through the whole of it. But we will get on to designing, and we will get on to how I go about designing and showing you the programs that I use and the tools that I use, how I go about thinking about these things and translating my thoughts onto the computer in a way that we can then take it to a manufacturer and say, build that. So yeah, there we are. A kind of really quick sort of pseudo history lesson thing. Let me just whiz through the chat again before you all get going. So Kirk says hot sun equals sweaty wrists. Yeah, sweaty wrists. I think that's probably why Oliver and I avoid metal bracelets, because the whole metal round wrist sweat thing, I don't know. I think metal bracelets will probably be a requirement for the Morar Second Edition. It's dive watches and metal straps kind of go hand in hand. Ashley says the original Morar was spot on. Would love to see brighter colours on the watch face and hands in the next iteration if possible. Actually, I can do that. There we go. So I'll talk about this again in the next episode, what we've learned. There was a whole load of discussion around the colourways of the Morar, especially the kind of bumblebee version that we did one of. It was part of the kind of prototyping phase. But yeah, there's a whole load of discussion to be had in a future episode on colourways and things like that. Alex says, I agree with Andy, a dive watch is basically a tough watch, but I also like the concept of a dive watch that it can withstand going underwater, handy for a swim in the sea. Yeah, I think that's the general motive for people who buy dive watches. They want the robustness. I know that this can withstand pretty much anything, because it has been designed to withstand 300 metres of water pressure, which is quite a lot. So yeah, with you on that one, Alec. Kirk, an orange style Morar would be really popular. Can I get that in writing, Kirk? yeah, who knows what will be popular. I guess my natural instinct is to try and do things from a unique perspective and not follow the crowd. But there needs to be recognition that people want certain things. So, yes. Rab says, I agree, actually, a full loom and a purple dial version, please. Now, Kirk's here, so I'll say this while he's here. Kirk wrote to me in early 2020 and said the colour of the year for 2021 would be purple. And I don't know if it did turn out to be purple, but Kirk's been on the purple bandwagon for a while. Andy says, to be honest, I believe if the first Morar had been 42mm, it would have sold better. Maybe I do agree with you, Andy, but the kind of rationale behind doing a 40mm dive watch for the Morar was that at the time, 2017 this was, dive watches were getting bigger and bigger. Some dive watches were 45, 48, 50mm, big old muckle, great big things. And in the process that I took to think about what did we want to do, it threw up all these historical dive watches which were 40mm and smaller, 38mm. And so I thought, well, that would be really cool if we could make our dive watch 40mm from a historical perspective, and not only that, make an incredibly robust and tough little thing, 300 metre resistance dive watch, but make it 40mm. So that's why it was 40mm. It was more of a kind of historical and technical challenge perspective. Alex says, machined bezel, both numerals and grip, is a must. Yeah, I'm a big fan of this aesthetic, the kind of machining of metal to show the relief and give you detail and semantics, turn the bezel this way through the direction of the grip. When we launched the Morar, I was convinced that somebody would end up filling those machined markings with loom paint, and nobody ever did. And I'm really disappointed that nobody has, because I thought that would look really cool. I should have just done it myself, but I didn't. But somebody needs to do that, because I think it will look really cool, especially with the kind of bronze and gunmetal finish. So I think that's pretty much all. Is there an effective way to design round thickness of the watch versus water resistance? There's certain immovable things, crystal thickness, wall thickness. The material just needs to be that thick to be able to withstand these pressures. Hand heights on movements has a big direction on how thick a watch is. You can get low hand height movements, the pinions are really short, so you can keep your hands quite close to the dial, and that will give you the clearance above the seconds hand to make it thin. But the most effective way is just to say, right, what's the minimum thickness this needs to be to achieve X depth, and then that's your baseline. That's how thin it can be, along with your movement. And that's kind of really the most effective way. Just find the baseline and work from there. Oh, this must be Ollie. Is Ollie on this? Ollie never said to me that he was going to join tonight, so I don't know if Oliver's on this live stream, but asking for a friend, do you think that achieving the ISO standard adds genuine value to a dive watch? I think it does not, because people seem to be driven by aesthetics and capabilities, and you have to educate people as to why it has divers on the dial. If you don't know about the ISO standard, then you wouldn't know what divers meant. So they've just wrote divers on it because it's a diver's watch. Enthusiasts certainly would and do know what divers 200 meters means, and it does add value to those sorts of people. But Marlow watch companies seem to be the natural entry point for a lot of people into the mechanical watch market. And so we have to be careful what we're presenting as the entry point, and price has a lot to do with that. And so even considering the ISO standard, you would have to play off the cost of that versus what value it gives you. And that the value is being able to write divers on the dial. And does that then mean it gives people unfamiliar with this whole world, dive watch world, value? I don't know. But thanks for throwing that snowball in, Oliver. I appreciate that. Why do so many watches have orange colour in them? The deeper you go in water, the more colour is lost. And the most resilient colour is yellow, which is why a lot of dive gear, valves, flippers, dive watch dials are yellow, because it's the last colour to go from the colour spectrum the deeper you go. I think the one up from that is orange. So I think a lot of watches have orange in them because, it's just in general, it's a nice colour to have on watches. I'm a big fan of orange on watches. But in a dive watch perspective, it's because of the loss of colour the deeper you go. Right. Paul says, there is something cool about my helm being ISO tested, or something to the story. It adds something to the story, yeah. It does. I did read about Helm today, and how they positioned themselves physically next to their manufacturer, so they could assure that they were matching the quality they expected. We can't do that. I live in Scotland, and I love Scotland, and I don't think I would like to move anywhere else. But yeah, Helm are doing pretty good things, and especially at the price points that they're able to hit. I don't think you need ISOs. 99% would not need it. Well, this is another question, Andy, isn't it? It's you're creating this watch, a dive watch, which already we've established is not really of any use really to people professionally. And so you're then creating a watch that is capable and to these standards. For what reason? So that people can say that it is? Is saying that your watch is this capable of value to people? I don't know. It seems to be a growing sentiment here that ISO testing isn't really of interest. Yeah. Loads of messages about ISO standards. Right. Kirk, there you go. Told you it was purple and pink, but that was last year. Checked with Pantone. So, there we have it. Part 2. So thanks everyone for coming and staying with me on a Tuesday evening. It's been really great fun. I love talking about how we do things. We don't get to do it enough. We certainly need to be getting out there more and more and getting Marlow in front of people. And this is a good way to do it. And I like interacting with you all on these things. And like you've seen, there's a lot of things that people don't know. And especially if we don't talk about them, then some decisions can be seen to be a bit odd. Why did you say that the Morar was designed to ISO standards? Why didn't you test it? The questions like that, if we were doing this live stream thing, people would know. So yeah, really good fun. Thanks for joining us. And the next episode will be in around about 2 or 3 weeks. We're coming into Christmas now, which is our busiest period. So we'll see how we can do it, and then we'll announce it as we go. So yeah, thank you for coming, and take care of yourself and each other, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks, guys.